Okay, you should have anticipated me covering this. Um, I already gave a response, so there it is. Another thesis, so let's get into that. And also, there's two parts? Huh. That's not where I was supposed to put that. I don't know why. What the shit happened? Okay, let me explain. I thought I went to another video and put this comment there. So I'm gonna have to just remove this and put that over somewhere else later. We don't need to care about that. And I can probably delete it from here without any concern. Yeah, I'll delete it from here. This is not where it's supposed to be. In fact, give me a second. Yeah, anyway, we're going back to that other video, and I'm still seeing the comment show up here, so I'm very confused. What's happening? Chat, I just deleted that comment. It is back. Um, let's just ignore that happening. I don't know what's happening. I don't care. It's not prevalent to the information of this video. So let's just take a look at, did the comment show up on the other guy's video? It did not. That is so freaking stupid. Give me a second. Okay, finally, YouTube did its thing and correctly put my comment where I actually got them placed it. I think I'm still not seeing it on his video. What the hell is happening? Where did my comment go? Regardless of that, let's look at this entire nonsense. Okay, of course there are smaller components than photons, virtual photons, and the component of the background radiation. Far more likely candidate. Notice in the double slit experiment, the single electron is still affected by the interference pattern. My reasoning is that the field itself makes the pattern. The electron is along for the ride. Because the EM scattering beam, aka the observer, destroys the interference pattern but not the electron. It goes straight through. No one gets the double slit experiment correctly. Just me. That's a bold statement, but I'm still fucking saying it because I haven't seen anyone get the double slit experiment correctly. At me. I don't care. Seriously, grow up and learn how the physics really works and say it correctly one time. Anyone, I dare you. Please. The connection of the electron has to a proton, protons, neutrons, electrons, that stuff. That energy makes the interference pattern, not the electron itself, just an object manipulating that energy. Also, a photon can increase the speed of an electron. At higher speeds, the orbiting object will run into itself. Electrons orbit I had to adjust the statement to be near quadrillion times around an atom per second. I didn't say that per second, but it doesn't matter. I think I say it later. I based this off of the speed of the electron confined to an orbit. The fuzzy electron uncertainty is due to the extreme number of orbits per second around an atom. If you increase its speed, imagine a longer travel time confined into that tiny space. Fuck the syntax. Hello, chat. By a leaving. Were you? Anyway, you would also increase its speed around the atom because of its increased speed is also essentially having echoes around the atom is due to it is one electron. So these many echoes and the echoes increase with greater speed, equal to the electron's total speed divided by the number of orbits. There is no uncertainty because if you are a quadrillion times per second accurate, you'll see things. There will still be multiple electron echoes when the electron's orbiting an atom. The photoelectric effect. Energy of the photon does not increase its size, it increases its speed. Why? The standard photons are 100 times faster. I refer to standard photons in contrast to virtual particles or something else. The standard photons are 100 times faster, so it gets a bump. Although in these statements I have not reconciled the actual structure of the electron, I hope you better understand its functions. One of you scientists has to grow up, think, and stop thinking that uncertainty is true. You have to understand. The electron simply is orbiting so many times. And I didn't mention the exact number of the speed of the electron and then reduce it down to the size of the orbit of an atom because that math is easily referable by anyone else. But when you think of 2.2 thousand kilometers or 2.2 million meters per second, you don't think, because 1,000 kilometers is a large amount of kilometers. For example, my entire town is only 5 kilometers. So 1,000 kilometers per second is extreme distance. So 2.2 million kilometers per second, or 2.2 million meters per second, then translating down to the size of a part of a meter per second I think it's a tenth of a nanometer, the area around an atom. And you can do some math and realize that is around 2.2 or 22 quadrillion atomic width per second. Either case, that's a large number, and it's either 5 quadrillion orbits per second or it's 500 trillion orbits per second. That's a big amount of orbits per second. So every time it orbits, it's like, I've compared this to yarn or a measuring tape, and every time that it processes around an atom, it's still processing another hundreds of trillions of times around that same atom per second. You're going to bump into yourself. You're going to spread out into as many positions as possible. And that fuzzy cloud that you're seeing is every position that has existed in that second. It has not, it's not a percentage of it being there. It is a remnant of the past that all of those can be visualized at the same time because it's physically there in all of those hundreds of trillions of positions every second. So even if you have an amazing kind of microscope or nanoscope that can get you towards the size of an electron and then get you to be able to visualize the electron, you still have to be accurate to billion frames is not even close to fast enough to visualize it. And I saw someone have a billion frames per second camera, not a billion frames per second electron microscope, for example. Also, you're completely wrong. You can totally visualize an electron with other electrons. Don't be stupid. Come on. The size of an electron is crazy, but other electrons zooming by are going to have distortions and whatever else, and you can completely know where the other electrons are compared to where they would have been or where they are, and you can calculate all of that stuff based off of the way that they bump each other, the way that the other ones end up on the other side. You can resolute anything with that. But it would be better to use spectrum light, not white light, which comes in all of its flavors all at once, but all of its separate flavors individually sent in their own spectrum so that you can differentiate between each of the different flavors of light, which is a vast, amazing energy per section difference. So you're able to really get extreme resolutions with tiny little probe that genuinely only needs one photon bandwidth, but because of the difference of the different frequencies of light that you're able to pack in there one after another, you're not overcharging it, so you're not going to get a black hole. Stop being dumb. And you're going to get all these different frequencies will allow for, like, literally the moment you notice any frequency shift in any of those frequencies, you'll be able to resolve all that information, and you can find even the three-dimensional quantities of quarks if you wanted to. The resolution is insane with spectrum light, because the differences between every spectrum is so tiny that it's even that is smaller than quarks. I'm not just making that up. So neat. If you ever want to visualize electrons correctly, use spectrum light. You're welcome. I don't actually think that they're made of... Oh, are they made of photons? That's what this entire video is about.
Previous ones, because today I want to discuss the structure of the electron. Since J.J. Thomson demonstrated the electron's existence in 1897, scientists have measured many of its properties, like its charge, mass, dimensions, magnetic dipole.
So it's ironic that you have mass and dimensions, and yet you also say it's a dimensionless point. Both cannot be true. Obviously, electron is not only dimensioned, but it's dimensioned to be many times larger than a photon. So it stands to reason that you could think of photons as being a component of an electron. However, I have a little bit of gripe with that because, again, like he says, you have to somehow figure out how to confine a photon inside this shape that they're telling you it is. And I think electrons are actually more wide than this, not skinny little donuts. But I mean, it's similar. It almost makes sense. But again, you gotta realize if the photons are doing that, then there's some kind of other mechanism similar to how quarks are doing things inside protons, even tinier than we expect, that could allow a photon to be confined in this way and end up making an electron in the first place. It's also interesting, he says that you can make photons or you can make electrons out of and in pairs with gamma radiation. That's fascinating. So like a mega electron volt is capable of producing an electron and a positron, which I love that. We can just make electrons. What the hell? Just do that. That's awesome. But also, similarly, there's something about... Okay, it stopped doing the previews because it's a little bit slow or something. There's a lot of it to look through. There's clear problems with... They talked about the idea of gravity. So it can't be gravity that's holding it together or whatever. That makes sense. Yeah.
Point-like entity into something that is truly physical. How charge, magnetic moment and spin emerge by confinement of a field in a toroidal shape, and the fact that we cannot measure its size or structure.
Okay, it's not wrong that electrons have toroidal type or, a lightsaber type shape. I had some of those. They're tasty. Anyway, or a donut shape is more understandable. The thing about it is that you gotta know its magnetic moment is throughput, like they said. So Yeah, and here they say, oh, it can't be a mini black hole because
due to relativistic effects must be smaller than this value. And this effect
gravity itself,
resolve
even at that size, like in order to resolve something like an electron from photons, you would have to have the gravity it takes to, first of all, get that photon to go around in that orbit, making the electron happen in the first place. But again, that requires a structure that is not the photon itself. It only explains perhaps the shape of the electron, and it explains it really well, but you could also not use photons. You could use, like I say, it's more likely that you're going to use virtual particles or the components of stuff that's in the background radiation, not photons themselves. You don't need to use photons themselves. But again, it's like saying that in order to really understand an electron, if it is photons bound inside of something much larger than a photon is, and they're constantly moving in a circle, then it's curious why gamma radiation would make an electron and a positron because of charge symmetry. Like why they can't form on their own, which is interesting. It still begs, all of this still begs the question, what is that mechanism holding a photon in that weird, first of all, it is a weird orbit, this shape that they mention. Where the hell is it?
Set these field value.
This weird shape design based on the odd orbit, which is a curlicue winding on itself, and it does make sense. You could still have something doing that function, but you can't just visualize that. You have to visualize the mechanism doing the holding of the energy of whatever type it is inside of that function. So there are two things. One, there is a completely separate power mechanism that forces the photon to undergo this kind of motion. Something it's orbiting, which in itself still allows for a magnetic throughput, which is fascinating. Because electrons are dipoles, meaning they have a north and south pole. The energy flows through them like a toroid. So the energy is working that way already. But they're saying the shape of it is like that because of... I can't help but think that there is another simpler explanation that electrons could be misshapen photons. Hear me out. The other question is, okay, so the first idea for the misshapen photon is imagine you have some kind of kite or whatever else and propeller unit, and for some reason it's like a missile that's constantly pushing itself forward, and then it has to turn in order because of its shape, like a boomerang or something, that it is constantly turning, and its interaction with the electromagnetic field has it constantly changing its trajectory. But something like that wouldn't like you would think it wouldn't alone make an electron, but a simple curlicue like this, where it has, you have to understand the rest of it is the magnetic and electromagnetic fields that are derived from just simply the motion of the thing. So it's possible that an electron could self-govern because of its magnetic field, because of its electric field. Once it's in that curling function, you don't need another internal structure to keep it curling. It'll just stay doing that. And also, its natural moment would force it into certain chirality, like it seems to be doing. We find these other electrons that have up and down poles, and I think at some point he mentions there are 4 different variants of it where you have the spin as well as the up and down. I don't know where he mentions that, and I don't care super much, but just imagine that you can see that, where it's this, but then there's another 2 in the diagram that show if you flip them, and you can imagine like these, but then you flip it and there's a possibility that you still have the magnetic moment go up and down. So there's 4 variants of these electrons. Or really there's only 2 variants of the electrons, where the flipping of it upside down is just telemetry or whatever, where that's the wrong word. Flipping it upside down doesn't actually change its structure. Like if you flip a cup upside down, it's still a cup. It's just you looked at it from a different perspective. But then there's this idea that somehow the energy could be flowing in a different direction. And there is really, it's hard to imagine why, like in my head, it's hard to imagine why the magnetism would need to flow in a positive direction up or positive direction down specifically. because I didn't pay super much attention to this, but that doesn't matter too much. The point is, can we reconcile that this is actually the answer? And the thing is, my first assessment is photons have their own speed, right? So a photon confined like this easily can happen if you have a bent photon, where its normal precession in what would otherwise be a straight line is like if you were to bend that part of the missile that trajects it into a circle. If you can make a Bumpanoggin plane, you can make something like this where it's constantly forward momentum, can't take it anywhere else except for in a circle. And the magnetic properties and the properties that emerge out of that really would be the only thing that you need to hold it in place. So you don't need like some extra mechanism. That is interesting. But again, that requires that you imagine a photon that has a structure capable of bending its format in on itself. So as you might understand, the magnetic field lines are toroidal, donut shape. So that would help with. But again, you gotta imagine what is the energy making the electromagnetic field of the magnetic lines. That energy itself is another thing entirely. I still think the electron has its own structure. Yeah, when people think of like it could be gravity holding it together like a mini black hole, you're totally ignoring the fact that photons could just be bent, that they could just be trajectory skewed, and the magnetic is all you need. Magnetic magnetic is stronger than gravity. Why would you need anything else? I'm sorry. What? Like, no. You don't need anything more stronger than magnetic to hold a thing like this together. Considering the electron is so powerful with its magnetic field. The theory is starting to grow on me a little bit that it could be electron or it could be photons that are like just forced into an orbit into a spinning pattern. The thing that gets me the most stuck is the interaction between gamma radiation and how you can make electrons in the first place. That is a long time for that entire section. There it is. There's that quad thing I was talking about. where you have the electromagnetic stuff happening in all of its different configurations, where it could be cycle left, cycle right, with the up or the down. Obviously, those 4 different states make for 4 different flavor, or, well, it's still really only, is it? Huh? I think it's still only, okay, I have to really think about this. Yeah, notice how the rotation seems to be the same diagonally. So if you think about it the same diagonally and you're just switching the ups and downs, then you have really only 2 types of electrons, not 4. Because it doesn't matter about, like, the spin state can switch around 2 different ways, and then the magnetic spin can switch around for both of those. Why does that only seem to map into 2 in my brain? Because I think of the spin state being one thing, the magnetic state being the other thing. I guess it is 4 different types of electrons. Whatever.
States. Now, the paper describes these ideas in much more detail. For example, it demonstrates how this configuration leads to half-integral spin values, or how to calculate a magnetic dipole moment that matches experiments. I will not replicate these derivations here, but what I will do is quickly show you the calculation for the value of the charge. The derivation of charge from photon energy works as follows. We assume that there is some dimension r that represents its size and has a direct relationship with Compton wavelength. This allows us to estimate the electron's volume. We're also assuming that the energy density in the electron is stored in equal amounts in the electric and magnetic field density. This results in the electric field energy density to be half of the total energy density. We actually know the total internal energy based on the Compton wavelength of the electron, and this allows us to relate field value at dimension r to the total energy contained in the electron. So, by combining all these relationships, we can calculate the average resulting field value. And what we'll do next is relate this field value to the field of a classical Coulomb charge at radius r. Here are the 2 equations together. To the left our particle, and to the right the field at radius r for a classical Coulomb charge with a charge value q. And what we can do is combine these 2 formulas and extract the charge value q that satisfies the equality. Now in the paper, this elaborate equation is simplified a bit first, but by using this final result, we can now fill in the values and arrive at 1.47 times 10 to the minus 19 Coulomb for the charge generated by the model. If you compare this value to the value experimentally measured for the electron, you see that it's quite close, but not exactly the same. It's about 9% lower. However, it illustrates...
It's interesting, so you can have the intuition and all the math checks out so that it would make sense that it's this, but for some reason it's the other thing, and so you end up with you'd have to skew a few things in your equations to allow your equations to properly express what it is in reality. But it's very close, and that's hilarious. But of course, I don't know any of these symbols except for, of course, pi and the long division, like the functions. But like, what is the 3, the backwards 3, all of that I don't know. I don't get into the math of this junk.
How, with relatively simple reasoning, we can calculate a value for charge that is remarkably close to the experimental value.
This is why I don't get into the math, is because all of these different ideas can help you understand maybe the relationship between things, but it doesn't. There's obviously that 9% shows that there's some discrepancy between math and reality that we're just, you gotta just admit that's just how it is. So your initial assessment of whatever else you think is supposed to happen, grain of salt, figure out what actually is, and work with that. But also it means that you can then inform your equations, make better assessments, and then probably understand things better. So when I talk about virtual particles versus photons, even still, I have to reconcile something about what would make the structure of the photons change so that their trajectory is no longer straight forward, which is their normal function, which they are going to do regardless of most things, with the exception of obviously an electromagnetic field, which the electron has. So it's one of those weird where it's like my head gets stuck at chicken or egg, but I also end up with like, no, it makes sense. Once it starts spinning, then it has that spin moment. And ironically, we also talk about at some point this spin up and down thing it was talking about in the beginning where it had.
But there are other properties of the electron that are rather incompatible with a point-like entity, for example, magnetic dipole moment and spin. It's impossible to imagine how properties with a spatial asymmetry can be physically present in a point-like entity. And this
So obviously no one believes it's a point-like thing. There was something about the he showed the stuff from Free Blue One Brown, and that was pretty to look at. Where did that happen in the video? There it is. That's that stuff. And here's the thing. You think about it oscillating up and down, but then there's another idea where it can rotate, and that's not represented in the three-dimensional whatsoever. In order to represent that, you would have to have a completely different, like oscillating side to side as well thing, and that's just not happening here.
and it's easier to understand by just considering the values in a single plane, or even just what it looks like along a single line. Here you observe that in every single point along the line, the electric field alternates between positive and negative values. But there are also electromagnetic fields that look somewhat different. For example, circularly polarized fields associated with circularly accelerated charge. What you notice in this case is that the electric field value is never zero, but has a constant magnitude y.
Yeah, so again, if you're taking photons, putting them into this spin like that, there are certain things that it would make more sense if that up and down that we saw earlier would also have wobble in it. But the wobble could be so, like, minuscule compared to the total size. But it's like, according to this, the motion is not, the motion of the photon is not circular in that direction. It's circular in this direction, so that the donut is made that does the wobbling. And again, for a photon doing that, like, it does make so much sense that it would just have a moment where it's first traveling up and then again downward, so it has its motion like that naturally, oscillating between those two in a diagonal orbit. The electromagnetic field the electric and the magnetic fields warping it that way. I end up really stuck. I end up not being able to find other reasonings for why these things are happening, because it seems, and it is so, it's a, I love the fact that it talks of so many different things and it makes sense in this way. Now you think of this and it doesn't quite make sense, but you have to understand that instead of a band of actual physicality that's working in this way, it's just a single photon that is moving in this band's directions. So that explains the motion of it. It does not mean that you have to have something physical in that shape. So that's a thing.
In the same direction. And finally, because of the confinement of field energy and momentum in space, this structure would automatically represent its energy worth of inertial mass. So let me show you how this works using a bit of tinkering. Here you see me drawing the electric and magnetic field orientations and the energy propagation direction on a strip of paper. And I'll do the same on the other side. So if I take this strip and bend it into a configuration that represents circular polarization, I can connect the beginning and end such that the field is continuous and arrive at this double helix. And if we now examine the outside of this helix, we indeed observe the indicated electric and magnetic field directions of the schematic. Okay, this model is kind of crude, so let's now refine it a bit. What the authors propose is that the field and its internal momentum is distributed through space in what looks like a donut or toroid. In this image, a chunk of the donut is cut out to reveal its internal structure, showing several nested toroid shapes. This representation might suggest that the electron is a little donut, but that's not what this figure tries to express. It's actually a schematic of how energy flows and how the momentum is distributed in this model for the electron.
Yeah, it's just the movement of the thing that is going. It's essentially orbiting the magnetic moment. So, fascinating. Or that's what we propose that it's doing. And obviously anything with a certain amount of force and speed would allow for this. I'm not augmented photons again still requires a structure of a photon, which people are starting to believe that photons are just excitations in the electromagnetic field. They're not thinking photons actually have a structure, and the problem is photons do have a structure, so there's something about that. The bending of the paper in that does suggest that all it takes is, again, a curved fin type of, or some kind of curved momentum. The regular structure of the photon would be projecting the energy not just directly back, but back and with a kick. So it changes every press. As it's changing, it would go into this orbit. The magnetic electric fields would define how it. I can't get past that.
On the surface of the donut, the authors have drawn curved lines, which are called geodesics. Each geodesic curves over the surface of the donut in a closed loop and is 1 Compton wavelength long. One of the geodesics is accentuated and shows the direction of momentum and the flow of energy. And if you follow along its path, you see that it indeed describes a double loop. The nested toroids are drawn here to indicate that the internal momentum is not located in a single surface, but is contained in a continuous structure that expands both inward as well as outward. Because a single Compton wavelength is contained in
Well, obviously, like any orbit is not simple. It has its outermost like any planet, an orbiting system has its orbit around a egg shape. So you can almost see it there, although it has more of a up and down. The loop has like a second part to it than the standard planetary thing, because we don't just go tightly around the sun a lot. We don't have that kind of an orbit. That would be bad if we did that. Um, because that would mean we have a lot more closely. Instead, we just have a one loop, and it makes more sense that it would do something like this, but this is conventional. Why would we need it to do a double loop? Again, you go into something with momentum, and you have to ask yourself, why would it hold it tighter, and why would it let it go looser? And the answer is, it doesn't have to do that. So you're ignoring spatial mechanics when you make this diagram, and that's what pisses me off slightly. Is there any reason to assume that it would go into this kind of double loop shape? And sorry, no, it doesn't have to do that in order to create the toroid. Although it's convenient to say that it do something like this, it's more convenient to say that the loop, as you would so this is the only part that might be wrong, is that it does this double loop thing. I don't think it needs to do that at all. Get that out of your head. Go back to a normal orbit, any normal orbit, and because the principle of an object in motion will stay in motion unless otherwise acted on, there's no reason for it to do this double loop. All it has to do is a single egg-shaped loop, and that loop is shifting as it goes around. You can make the same argument without needing to do this random extra curlicue. I don't I don't think it's required that you have this shape of the orbit of the supposed photon. But that's the real only gripe I have about this, is that you wouldn't need that to create the shape of the toroid. It would just be, yeah, you would just make the egg shape knowing what we already know about orbital mechanics, and you would just spin that around, you would end up with the same toroid shape regardless. So I think that's the first mistake of this paper. Well, the inner and outer bounds of orbits of a thing of speed, okay, to say that it's going in this weird extra tight circle and then letting go requires the understanding of what is making that tight orbit stay tight for a certain amount of time and then release, so that it can ever, like, you either have the binding energy of holding it in that orbit or you don't, right? The energy doesn't just fluctuate like that, does it? Unless you also fluctuate the magnetic field, which electrons are known to be, what? Are they stable? Yeah, I can't get past this. I can't unsee this. This is wrong, according to basic stuff that I know of. Not because I'm thinking, oh, it just has to be similar to planets because we already know planets. No, it's because momentum conservation. I can't reconcile the spin. to look like that. But that's just an imagining of how the internal structure is orbiting. It doesn't change the argument that it could be an orbiting photon. It's just how it's going about doing that. And I feel this is the one thing I've been able to contribute to this, because this model I think has to be inaccurate. Like, imagine you have that orbiting, and that orbiting is twisting and turning so that the object goes and then goes around and goes around and goes around, similar to how electrons go around atoms, even. Okay, so the reason why I'm okay with electrons having a certain amount of area that they can orbit instead of a finite area where they can orbit, because the energy is so similar, is because the electron itself has multiple echoes of itself interfering with its own self. It's not just a clean, neat orbit. It's an orbit that also has to kind of push everyone else out of the way, but also fluctuate and move smoothly, constantly, never hitting itself, which is fun. So, if you think of the inner and outer bounds of an electron's orbit as a similar function of what this looks like, then the natural magnetic its energy could be tightly bound around, but its natural momentum wants, like a photon is literally, again, 100 times faster than an electron. So for it to be confined this way, means the electromagnetic field has to be powerful enough that it can hold, besides the fact that it's holding the photon, I still think the photon has to be augmented, that it is forcing itself into a spin. That's all it takes. And I'm still not totally convinced about how it has this like distinct curlicue. Again, the reason why electrons have binding energies that are variant in their entire orbital shell by like an order of, what is it? I try to think of how wide the orbital shell is compared to the electron itself, and I forget, if it's 20 or 100 times the size of the electron, or 1,000. But it's a big variant, and again, it's due to its speed confined makes for the echoes. What if the electron is single photon forced onto a curl? Its orbiting moment would be so, like, imagine 100 times more speed than or imagine the speed of the amount of distance you can travel as a photon confined into the orbit of an electron. It is an even more great number. It would, I already have electrons orbiting atoms at 500 trillion times per second. For a photon, one, that number is bigger. Two, the confinement is smaller. For a photon to orbit into an atom, into an electron, is, and I haven't done the actual math of it, I'm just thinking about this now. In order for that to work, a photon would have to be easily screw it, I'll just do the math. You get near 300 million, and then that, near 300 million meters per second. Then you have that compressed down to the size of an electron, which is 10 to the minus 15th power. So compared to, so it's an extra 4 zeros, so easily into quintillions. But then you got another 100 because of the speed up from electron to photon. It's about 150, or about 149 times faster. We could do a little rounding or whatever else, and you end up in the sextillions of orbits per second for a photon in an electron, in order to, if you were to have a photon be part of an electron, it would be orbiting in the sextillions of times per second. That's trillion. I think. Don't quote me on that. Trillion is the first easy answer. That's not really the right number of zeros, is it? No, it isn't. Is it a billion trillion? What the hell is it? Well, you go trillion. How many more zeros is that? Sextillion. Screw it. That's the number. So if an electron's orbiting an atom at 5 quadrillion or 500 trillion times per second, the tinier size and the faster speed of a photon means that it would have to be 6 trillion times per second. And again, 6 trillion times per second is an insane RPM. So the electron itself would be, that would definitely create the electron's power that it's generating, just as an emergent property of it orbiting that fast. Do they say it's That's the problem. Do they say it's that the photon would have to be orbiting in the 6 trillion times per second range? I don't think I heard them saying that.
The radius r is equal to the Compton wavelength divided by 4 pi, which would suggest that the core of the structure is somewhat smaller than the Compton wavelength. From a physics perspective, it would actually be impossible to contain all the energy inside the space that is smaller than approximately half a wavelength. So the characteristic size of this object would be in the order of between half and 1 Compton wavelength. But as we'll see later, the exact size is not really that relevant. Let's now dive a bit deeper into the electromagnetic configuration as described in the model. So what the authors propose is that the magnetic field is always parallel to the surfaces indicated in the toroid. So the magnetic field lines shown here in blue form closed loops. Given the direction of the internal momentum, the electric field must therefore be perpendicular to the surface. This results in the electric field component shown in red to be orthogonal everywhere to the surface. Since the electron is negatively charged, the field is pointing inwards, according to the conventions of how to describe field direction. But of course, a situation where the magnetic field lines run in the opposite direction is equally feasible and would represent positive charge. Because we're considering the electron, let's stick with the negative charge representation for now.
Right.
So if you look at how the field itself rotates along the surface of a toroid, it's very similar to circularly polarized light. It actually rotates over 2 pi along the toroid surface and over 4 pi inside the toroid shape in a double loop.
See, okay, this structure of a more neat, confined, and again, the orbit and everything looks like the base energy, speed, and all that. It all is a specific amount of energy and momentum that is not this weird tiny curly Q that they were showing in the other diagram. This is more accurate. This is one that I can get more behind, and it makes sense more to me why it would do something like this. So not that weird tiny curl and then big curl, but these wider orbits make a lot more sense in my brain, and that it's something I can more likely assume is what is happening. But that does mean that the previous diagram is completely wrong. Still.
The most difficult aspect in this field description is how can you bend light such that it follows a curved path in space?
Well, it's simple. You just take the trajectory of its momentum compared to the electromagnetic field that it already exerts on the field and say that it is pushing, for example, now and then now and then now and then now and then now, and it keeps on turning. Like you what? The twist happens again, probably because of the shape of the photon itself. And all it has to do is have like a bent propeller. Something.
And and I will get back to this near the end of the video. Let me first elaborate a bit on the current model. The magnetic field lines are now oriented such that this structure has a net magnetic moment as indicated by the large blue arrow through the center. But there's something else that I want to point out about this structure that is much less obvious. If you take the mirror image of this object, the momentum is flowing in the opposite direction. This results in the magnetic moment pointing downwards instead of upwards. But if you now try rotating this structure back on itself, you're actually not going to get the exact same thing back. And that is because the geodesics will be following a different rotational path along the toroid surface. So these particles come in two different flavors that have different chirality and internally have two unique spin states for a part of the internally contained momentum. But both of these lead to an identical charge distribution and value for the magnetic dipole moment.
Right.
If we analyze the internal momentum along one specific geodesic, we can distinguish two types of angular momentum. One due to the momentum rotating around the toroidal axis over 4 pi, and the other due to a rotation of 2 pi along the toroidal surface. And as a consequence, the entity as a whole will not be some static momentum distribution in space, but one that is constantly reorienting itself due to precession. With the energy racing around at the speed of light inside the...
Yeah. The same thing happens with electrons. It does the weird oscillation of its orbital moment. It doesn't have just a distinct one.
volume that is the size of a Compton wavelength or smaller, the internal oscillation frequency will occur at 2 times the Compton frequency, which results in a rather large value for the internal oscillation frequency. What this effectively means is that the electron and its resulting external field will appear as fully spherosymmetric at any measurable time.
That's, again, because if you take sextillion orbits per second, it's extremely hard to reconcile any individual instantaneous moment in time. So, again, sextillion orbits per second, a much larger number than I ever expected to be imagining. Yeah, it's gonna seem pretty solid. But again, fluid mechanics, it's not uncertainty. It still could just be one photon. And it would make sense why it seems like a very solid mass. It literally can't do anything else but make the solid mass. See, that's the thing. When they say, oh, the number C and whatever else in the orbital precession, you got to understand it's going to be a big number. Say the big number. Sextillion is... Okay, so if you have a million, that is already 6 zeros. We consider just consider that every million, billion, trillion, each one of those is a multiple of 3 zeros plus at the end the one set of 3 zeros. So sextillion is 6 times 3 plus 3 or for a 6 sextillion, it is actually 7 sets of 3 zeros. So 7 times 3 is 21. That's 21 zeros. Yeah. That confined into the tiny space of minus 15. Or, no. The friggin... shut up. near 3 million per second, going to the minus 15 to make the orbit of the electron. Million already being two triplets of zeros or 6 zeros. Just add a couple more zeros because there are those hundreds of millions. In other words, 10 to the ninth, 9 plus 15 is 23. So saying, so it could actually be in the hundreds of sextillions per second.
Scale. Of course, everything I stated so far is also valid for the situation that the electric field lines are pointing outwards and the magnetic field is rotating in the other direction. And this state represents the positron, which we know has an identical charge but of opposite sign and has an identical value for the magnetic moment. And the positron, like the electron, can also have two unique internal spin states.
Right.
So let me quickly summarize what just happened. By assuming a toroidally shaped electromagnetic field distribution in the electron, charge and magnetic moment are emergent properties. The resulting electric field is spherosymmetric and allows for two opposing field directions indicative of positive and negative charge. And each of these two differently charged entities can have two distinct internal spin states. Now, the paper describes these ideas in much more detail. For example, it demonstrates how this configuration leads to half-integral spin values, or how to calculate a magnetic dipole moment that matches experiments. I will not replicate these derivations here, but what I will do is quickly show you the calculation for the value of the charge. The derivation of charge from photon energy works as follows. We assume that there is some combining all these relations charge at radius r.
We've been through that.
Here are the two equations together. To the left our particle and to the right the field at radius r for a classical Coulomb charge with a charge value q. And what we can do is combine these two formulas and extract the charge value q that satisfies the equality. Now in the paper this elaborate equation is simplified a bit first, but by using this final result we can now fill in the values and arrive at 1.47 times 10 to the minus 19 Coulomb. If you compare this value to the value experimentally measured for the electron, you see that it's quite close, but not exactly the same. It's about 9% lower. However, it illustrates how with relatively simple reasoning, we can calculate a value for charge that is remarkably close to the experimental value. Now, you might not have noticed at this point, but this formula for charge does not contain a radius or...
It's why Fermi estimations are able to be so accurate, because if you understand things on that level, all you need to do is computate like some geometric nonsense in your head and you can understand how much power how much megatons of explosion you experienced by the amount of force you notice a piece of paper having. That guy was a beast when it came to math. It was really cool. But also the framework of all of that force and whatever else stuff was like a table in his head that he could just be like slide it around and like, yeah, if it does this much force to the paper, this many megatons. Because he knows the distance, he knows the whatever else, and it has to be that way. And it's like, huh? Yeah, it do be like that. Okay.
Compton wavelength. And that is because we've made a specific assumption about the relationship between radius r and Compton wavelength. And the charge value that emerges under these assumptions is a consequence of the toroidal configuration and the internally stored energy. So the model would allow for tweaking of the theoretical value of the charge using some smudge factor in the relation between radius and Compton wavelength. However, the authors decided not to go down this path in the current paper.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's in a nutshell how.
Again, hundreds of sextillions, septillions of orbits per second for the photon in that shape that ends up becoming what we call a electron. La-di-da.
A fairly realistic value for charge emerges from the toroidal model. What I want to do next is discuss two questions that I'm pretty sure a lot of viewers might have now. And those are, how can you justify that a particle with the size of a Compton wavelength interacts point-like in high-energy collision experiments? And second, what could be behind the apparent curvature of space that leads to this type of field confinement?
The curvature of a kite can simply force, again, the curvature of the structure of the missile or kite or whatever, photon thing, does not require any other function in order to take place.
Let's start with the first question. From the model, a typical dimension for the electron in the order of a Compton wavelength emerges. But in high-energy collision experiments where electrons are accelerated very close to the speed of light, neither their size nor their internal structure is revealed. So why would electrons interact point-like when they aren't? To explain this discrepancy, the authors refer to the theory of Louis de Broglie called harmony of phases. This theory states that the phase associated with the internal oscillation should remain synchronized between different.
You realize what you're detecting when you have a electron collision is essentially, again, it's not even point-like. A photon has specific size compared to like the Planck length or whatever. Electrons are vastly bigger than conventional photons. So you notice a dot, that doesn't make it a point. What? Again, when you're looking at the fuzziness of the electron cloud around an atom, you're looking at either 5 quintillion or 500 trillion orbits around an atom per second. Its blurriness is due to all of the entire distance it can travel, shrunk down and compressed to the orbit of an atom. So no, it's 22 quadrillion atomic whips per second, shrunk down to the orbit of an atom. Which is why I make it about 5. For some reason, I'm wrong about that. I don't really care. It's a big number. The point is, it's a big number. So, again, electrons would be a single dot. And we already know that its size is extremely tiny. But its size is still known. It's still not point-like. It is dot-like. It's not point-like. Point-like is like dimensionless. It is dot like in the form of it is circular.
Inertial reference frames. So this theory tries to reconcile the relativistic effects of time dilation with the internal phase or clock of
No, just don't stop that. Stop that nonsense right now.
the energy oscillating within a moving particle. And the conclusion of de Broglie was that every moving particle must have an accompanying wave with a wavelength that is dependent on its momentum. In other words,
Oh fuck, I have to.
between different inertial reference frames. So this theory tries to reconcile the relativistic effects of time dilation with the internal phase or clock of the energy oscillating within a moving particle. And the conclusion of de Broglie was that every moving particle must have an accompanying wave with a wavelength that is dependent on its momentum. In other words, dependent on its internal mass and velocity. And under relativistic conditions, you'd have to add the Lorentz factor in the momentum calculation. So where does this wave behavior in particles come from? Well, basically, it's the result of interference between the Doppler shifted parts that make up the total internal momentum. Let me try to explain this using some simplified schematics. Here we have a particle that is static with respect to the reference frame we're currently in. And for illustrative purposes, we assume that the internal energy is running in circles with the speed of light like a little clock. Now, because this particle is static, its velocity and therefore its momentum is zero. So according to the formula, a particle at rest would have an infinitively long de Broglie wavelength. But this statement is actually meaningless because defining a de Broglie wavelength only makes sense for particles that are actually moving through space, as hopefully will become clear.
If the photon. Okay. Imagine you're a photon going around in circles, and then you suddenly got pushed in a certain direction. You're not going to experience the same amount of force as is regular. You would experience a bit of lag in one direction, less in the other direction. So the fluctuation of its size and that due to its speed through space again is not a wave-like property. It's or it's an oscillating property, perhaps. There's oscillation in it because you talked about the photon going in circles rapidly. It's a different.
Consider the same particle moving with velocity v in our reference frame. To maintain internal phase synchronization, part of the internal oscillation must be redshifted to a lower frequency and another part blue shifted to a higher frequency. And the red and blue shifts are of course intended as an analogy to visible light to indicate this change in frequency. So for a moving particle, internal momentum and energy is distributed over a range of frequencies. And these frequency components are not spatially separated as this schematic illustration implies. They're actually superimposed and produce a net phase interference in the internal momentum distribution. And it's this interference that results in a beat frequency. Now, the de Broglie wavelength corresponds to the wavelength of this beat pattern as a particle moves through space. So the fact that every moving particle has a de Broglie wavelength does not mean that a particle is actually a wave. It means that the internal oscillation of energy and momentum manifests itself as a wave-like distribution within a specific inertial reference frame. So with this in mind, we can understand why a faster moving particle has a shorter de Broglie wavelength. It's because the red and blue shifts are larger in this case, and the interference results in a higher beat frequency. And if we now consider a particle with larger mass, in other words, a particle with a shorter quantum wavelength and a higher internal frequency, the
photoelectric effect, faster energy here, photon, making different energy output. That makes sense.
resulting de Broglie wavelength will be shorter than that of a lighter particle at the same velocity. The characteristic wavelength revealed in this way is inversely proportional to the momentum of the particle. And yes, it's real, it can be experimentally observed in basically every particle that has momentum. And this made the equation of de Broglie to one of the pillars of modern physics. What I just described is actually very closely related to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. If you compare the distribution of momentum circulating in a particle that is moving to that of a stationary one, it must be wider due to a shift to higher and lower frequencies within the total momentum distribution. And so the uncertainty in momentum widens as a particle moves faster, which allows for
The uncertainty principle is talking about an electron orbiting an atom. Because they're simpletons, not thinking about how it's orbiting at quadrillion times per second. And that's going to be a lot in a tiny space. So it's going to look like a blur. So it's hard to reconcile where it was at any given 1/quadrillionth of a second, because it could have been here, 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 here. It's hard to tell which one of them echoes was the one of this quadrillionth of a second, or this quadrillionth of a second, or this one, which was a different quadrillionth of a second. I think he's moving off script.
uncertainty of a particle's position to shrink in measurements because of the uncertainty relationship between the two. Determining the size of a particle in experiments is all about observing its interaction with other particles. The authors determined that the resolving power of one particle with respect to another one is equal to the de Broglie wavelength divided by 2. But in the paper, they also show that the characteristic dimension of the electron due to relativistic effects must be smaller than this value. And this effectively means that you cannot resolve the internal structure of an electron using an electron. The last question that I want to discuss here is the mechanism behind the energy self-confinement. So how can an electromagnetic field curve such that it becomes a local oscillation in space? In search of an explanation, the authors consider several mechanisms. Can the curvature leading to the confinement, for example, be gravitational? Light is known to bend around heavy objects.
No, it's just simply a structure thing.
And cause gravitational lensing. And of course, an electron is not a heavy object, but the effects of gravity are not related to mass per se, but to the energy density in space. And the electron might locally contain a high...
Again, electromagnetism is stronger than gravity, so you wouldn't need something like a tiny black hole to do this. The electromagnetism does it itself.
Energy density. However, we can rule out gravitation as a cause because the effects expected based on the local energy density would be way too small to offer any kind of explanation.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about some kind of magnetic confinement? In the model, we observe that the magnetic field lines are neatly aligned in closed loops. So maybe this creates some kind of energy minimum which keeps the field in the current state. Williamson and van der Mark don't rule out this option, but they argue that it cannot be the only mechanism responsible. And that is because this type of confinement should be scalable and allow for different values of the internal energy. In other words, it would not by itself have to lead to a...
In other words, again, the structure of the photon is that it will curve itself naturally. It will only move in that curve. That curve then also makes the magnetic field and electromagnetic field, the electric and magnetic fields. That helps it stay in its shape. It doesn't make it be there in the first place. The first place is its structure forces its expression to be in a curvy trajectory. And because it's a structure thing, it really can't take any other shape. You would have to change a value of a photon's energy expression, like he mentioned with the Doppler effect type thing. And that's not easily adjustable, I assume. I mean, there's only so many structures you can make with interference and stuff like that. So, like, again, the photon is moving around at hundreds of sextillions or septillions of orbits per second in order to achieve the size of an electron. This is a massive number. Ten to the 25 orbits per second, or whatever it was I said. Is it 27? 21?
Single unique internal energy of half a mega electron volt. So the distinct energy value indicates that there must be some additional mechanisms at play. Which brings us to whether the confinement involves nonlinear phenomena. It's known that intense electromagnetic fields can also curve space-time, and the field value where this is expected to happen is known as the Schwinger limit. It refers to a critical field value of approximately 1.3 times 10 to the 18th volt per meter, which is extremely high. At this field value, the polarization of space becomes so strong that the vacuum cannot support the field anymore. And it's at these field values that matter can emerge from an electromagnetic field. However, if we estimate the average field value inside the electron based on the current configuration, it's quite a bit smaller than the Schwinger limit value. So I guess the curvature of space cannot be explained from the field value being at the Schwinger limit here. However, the Schwinger limit could of course serve as a barrier between two different types of electromagnetic field behavior. One where the field can frolic around freely, and one where it got trapped locally in space. And in that sense, it's interesting to think about how the energy confined in an electron could escape spontaneously. Electrons are considered to be stable because they do not decay in isolation, unlike, for example, much heavier elementary particles like the muon or composite particles like the neutron, which both have relatively short lifetimes. But electrons and positrons are stable, and they also have the lowest mass of all charged elements.
Yeah, like, again, if you had a photon doing this and it was 6 septillion orbits per second, very little you can do to change how that works. So it would be extremely stable, yeah.
Particles. There are actually two other fundamental particles that contain less internal energy, but these are neutrinos, so they do not have charge, which means that an isolated electron cannot annihilate to form a bunch of neutrinos, nor can it convert back to photon energy, because such a conversion would also violate the conservation of charge. In fact, the conservation of charge is a super powerful principle that applies to every creation and...
Hold on. Stop. Stop, 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 stop. What is this thing that's interesting and stuck in my head just now is that if a photon is like a dipole, it's the thing that forces it to move forward in space. So if you take the photon, cut it in half, that you end up with the positron or the positron? Yeah. And the electron. Positive electron and electron. You end up having its function. So that means that only half of the components of the photon are used to make the electron. Does that not make sense? So that if you were to think of the electron, if you were to think of the photon as just whoa. If you think of a photon as being like a tennis ball, and then you cut that in half, imagine that you end up with one end is positive, the other end negative. But a photon is, it's so weird. A photon is so many times smaller than an electron, right? But somehow cutting it in half, it then spins out of control, makes an electron, which is much bigger than a photon, and slower by a factor of 100 something. What is it, 140 something times faster than an electron? So, interesting. I mean, obviously, if you don't have both of the two parts that was the photon, and also you don't have them recombine in such a way that you end up with I mean, just think of one of those spiral footballs, cut that in half, try to throw that motherfucker. You'll get a lot of answers. Perhaps. Like, its energy would whirl itself through space. Because it's trying to spin normally, but its ability to push is only in half of its direction. So, that is crazy. I always think of photons as a spiral football, by the way. which again is another thing with components. So yeah, if you cut that in half, then it ends up with half of its ability to exert energy against the electromagnetic field in the environment, and the other half doesn't have any force whatsoever, so it's forced into this spin. Its motion through space would have to curve. But then you're not working with a full photon, you're working with half a photon. So you wouldn't have to have exactly the same amount. So it wouldn't have to be, so you wouldn't expect it to be 100 sextillion of the speed. It could be less, could be like 50 sextillion of the speed. It's still a giant number. But whatever. Talk later.